Change is hard, not because you're doing it wrong, but because it asks something of you. Welcome to Change is Hard, a podcast from the Leadership Lab. I'm Audrey Blair, and this is a space for leaders who are learning how to sit with uncertainty, make decisions without rushing, and grow without losing themselves in the process. We'll talk about the moments that stretch you, the conversations you keep avoiding, and the quiet shifts that change everything. No noise, no pressure, just honest conversations about becoming the kind of leader and human you actually want to be. Let's get into it. Hi, how are you? Good to see you once again. I hope that you are having this time of year for us, it's coming up on the close of the end of the academic year. So we recently moved our daughter out of the dorm, hence my NC State hat there. And my son, who's finishing up his junior year, is doing his AP exams and this final few weeks of exams, and then heading into summer. Finally, here in North Carolina, I think we are now relatively stable on some warm weather, although we go from like 50 to 80 in just like that. We usually miss some of the cooler days. But anyway, I hope that things are going well with you. I want to talk to you about, and I hope you realize that a lot of things I talk to you about are things that I see on a regular basis. And recently, I was able to speak to a group of leaders, high functioning, a great group, great intentions. They had a lot of things going on. But I realized that they were also over functioning. They were taking over, kind of overdoing some of the things that they were doing. So I want to talk about one of those elements, because some of the most exhausted leaders that I know are the most competent people in the room. They're responsive, they're reliable, they're helpful, they're anticipating problems before anyone else sees them, and they get a lot of praise for it. They get more responsibility for it. Underneath all of that capability, though, often there's something else that's going on, because overfunctioning doesn't always come from excellence. Sometimes it comes from fear. The fear of things like disappointing people, the fear of being seen as lazy. If I'm not busy, if I'm not active, if I'm not always in something, then I might be seen as lazy. The fear of not being enough. Even the fear that if you stop carrying everything, that people might realize or think that you're not as valuable as you thought. And that is just a story that our brain tells us, because so much of the value comes from the tangible outward things that often people do. So I want to clarify what matters here, because people will initially hear work harder. But I want to separate out healthy leadership from compulsive leadership. There is a difference and there's a balance. So I'm going to give you some examples of these things and where you might be seeing yourself in them, and then we'll talk about ways to help that. But some examples of overfunctioning are things like solving people's problems before they even try. This is a classic thing. Someone brings you a situation without really even letting them get the whole situation out. In your mind, you're already solving the problem. In your mind, you already know what they should do. In your mind, and so you start telling them what they should do. Rather than listening and challenging them or helping to develop them, you want to solve those problems for you. Solve those problems for them, which means that you're jumping in too fast. So you're jumping in, there's a little bit of silence maybe in a room or in a meeting, and you're the one that feels like you have to be the one with the best ideas and with the most ideas, rather than giving space for others to bring up some of the things that they might be thinking about. Another one that I don't know that we pay that much attention to is carrying the emotional weight for everyone. So I'll talk about this in just a little bit, but the idea that if something is going on, if there's some panic in the room, or if there's some disappointment, rather than allowing yourself to feel that. If that's how you feel, then you've got to like clean it up for everyone. And then on top of that, managing everyone else's reactions. "Oh, no, no, let's calm down. Oh, no, no, let's not react that way. Oh, no, no," rather than giving space for those things. This also shows up with over preparing. That's one of mine, is to tweak things and over prepare. I have to consistently watch myself on that. But when you're preparing or thinking that I just one more piece of knowledge, one more thing I need to understand, one more thing I need to know, one more thing I need to look up, that gets out of control. Excessive responsiveness. How many of you are answering calls, emails, texts late after you said you weren't going to do it? You got your phone out. And in times when it's not a time of emergency, at times when it's not necessary, particularly when there are things that can wait to the next day. Sometimes people are just getting things off of their plate, not necessarily meaning they have to hear from you that same day or evening, but knowing the difference when to jump in and when to just let it be, which then comes with the inability to disconnect and let things go. This keeps you up at night. Things are toiling in your brain. You can't sleep because things are going over and over. You're over processing what's going on because you don't give yourself time in the day to let some of these things go. Some other examples, taking ownership for things that aren't yours. I've talked about this a couple of times. Taking someone else's responsibility. And when you can leave it with them, you want to take on their responsibility, becoming the emotional stabilizer in every room, constantly checking, difficulty delegating, maybe even rewriting other people's work for them. And then just that nagging feeling of I need to stay indispensable. And in order for me to stay indispensable, then I need to be continually doing something. So overfunctioning, it actually looks responsible from the outside, but that's why it's so sneaky. No one ever pulls you aside. Well, maybe a good leader will say, "Hey, you're overhelping," but usually you're not getting that feedback. "Hey, you're jumping in too soon or you're overhelping." Many times you've been rewarded for it. You've been promoted for it, and people start to depend on you for it. So then you continue doing that and creating more overfunctioning as time goes on. So the thought could be, if I do more, then I finally feel secure. Another thought could be, if I stay useful, valuable, if I stay needed, then I'll be safe. Then my job will be safe. I won't have anything to worry about. But a lot of leaders learn early that their value came from performance. And I've talked about that in the past as well. Being helpful, being smart, being mature, being responsible, being low maintenance, right? Have you ever gotten that praise? "Oh, I don't have to worry about you. You go do your thing. That's fantastic." Being the one who can handle it. "You know why I'm giving this to you? Because you can handle it." Which all those things can very well be true, but sometimes we equate them and we project them in the wrong way, or we continue doing it even when it's not necessary. Because eventually it becomes an identity thing for you. You're like, "I now have to be the one that cannot be ever irresponsible." And in that case, resting can feel irresponsible. Delegating can feel dangerous. "Well, if I'm the one that's supposed to be handling this, then I can't delegate." Not knowing, you might feel embarrassed or shamed if you don't know the answer to something. And oh my goodness, disappointing someone, forget about it. That can feel catastrophic. These are some of the emotional toll and some of the emotional rules that you might be following in this overfunctioning state. And overfunctioning is more likely emotional management. A lot of it isn't you're managing just the work. What you're managing or trying to manage is your discomfort. Let me give you some examples of that. Some examples of what I mean by managing discomfort or overfunctioning being emotional management. Things like when you have anxiety when someone else struggles. I get this from leaders a lot. "Well, I don't want them to struggle. I don't want them to have a hard time." So you try and manage around it. And you might get anxiety when someone else is having a hard time. You don't want to let them fail. A lot of discomfort when someone is disappointed. And yeah, that can be a bummer, someone being disappointed in you But rather than allowing yourself to feel that discomfort and going, "Oh man, that sucks," you try and avoid it at all costs, which ends up putting you in a space that you really don't need to be in. Fear of conflict. I hear this so much. I try to avoid conflict at all costs. That is you managing your discomfort with conflict. You're still in conflict. I just want you to realize you're still in conflict, but now with yourself. And now you're handling it all yourself rather than dealing with it with the person that you actually need to have a conversation with. The fear of being perceived negatively. Well, I don't want people to think that this way or that way, or I don't want to come across like I'm complaining. And there are ways to talk about and to give feedback without it coming across as a complaint. Sometimes feedback is necessary. Sometimes criticism is necessary. There can also be a fear of losing relevance. What if I'm not as important or as needed? Or what if my role isn't as needed anymore? So, sometimes sometimes leaders jump in too quickly, not because the team can't do it, but because watching someone else struggle makes you feel uncomfortable. And this is an area that can really get you in trouble. I was talking to a client not too long ago. I was working with someone who recently realized that they had this internal rule where they said in the meeting, they said, well, only one person is allowed to panic at a time. And so anytime someone else became emotional or upset or there was uncertainty or frustration, they immediately shifted into the stabilizer mode. Now, I've said this before. Yes, when there's a fire, we need someone to calm everyone down. We need a calmness in the room, but not everything is the fire. You don't always have to be the calm one or the fixer. I'll call it the fixer or the solver or the responsible one. Because to be fair, it does sound noble. But then when you realize that you haven't been taught or you haven't learned to allow yourself to have your own reaction or your own emotional reaction to something, that can make it really hard. That can make it really challenging. And rather than learning that, often people will try to avoid it. So when leaders will absorb tension and then try and manage all of it alone, it's hard then because now they might feel like, I can't let anyone see me wobble, and becoming emotionally over responsible. I was talking to a leader after a meeting once, and I was talking about something similar I was talking about making decisions and how you make a decision with the information you have at the time. And as time goes on and as new information shows up, it doesn't necessarily make that decision wrong. Well, there was a leader in the room, and she said, I had a situation where I made a decision, and the response and the way it turned out is not at all what we thought it was going to be, and certainly not the way I thought it was going to be. And she said, I feel really bad about that. And she said, but I would make the same decision over again, but my team is the one that's getting the brunt of that decision. But she was holding it all together. And I said, your team probably needs to hear that from you. They probably need to hear, I know we're getting a lot of flack from this decision, and I know you're feeling it. I want you to know that I'm feeling it too. And I also want you to know that if we were in that spot again, I would make that same decision again because it was the best decision at the time. And one, it helps them to realize that if they're feeling those things, they're not alone. It also gives them an opportunity to rally around you and to support you and encourage you as well. As leaders, sometimes we feel like, well, we got to handle it and do it all on our own. That is certainly not the case. Give other people the opportunity to support you. I want to talk a little bit about the cost. When you are over functioning, there are costs to you and to your team. So first, let's talk about what are the costs to you? What are some of these consequences? Well, we know burnout. People get burnt out. People also can start feeling resentment. You might start resenting your role, your team, your job, your boss. And while there might be things going on around you, while they might be doing things that you don't particularly like, some of that you're taking on yourself, which then leads to exhaustion. Another thing we don't realize is that you can lose your creativity. When you're in that survival mode, when you're highly stressed, it's hard to be creative at the same time. And it's also very difficult to think strategically. That strategic thinking time that you have, if you are in this overfunctioning mode, when you have time on your calendar, you can't even rest enough to think about the things you need to think about because it's constantly going in your head. Another consequence is emotional numbness. Have you ever gotten to the point where you're like, you know what? I don't care anymore. Just do whatever. I just don't even care. Just do it or don't do it. I don't care. And you want to try and avoid that as much as possible because the last thing you want is to have your identity collapse because you're feeling like, well, I'm not needed, so never mind, forget it, fine, and then walk out and do something rash. But these are some of the costs to this functioning to yourself, and some of the ways that your team feels it is that now your team has a dependency on you. There's reduced ownership. I talked about the not allowing people to take responsibility. Well, if you take the responsibility of certain consequences and certain things away from your team, how are they going to learn to take responsibility for some of these things? It creates a little bit of a learned helplessness, which then there's no growth. There's a lack of growth in that case, which then continues you overfunctioning because your team is not working. And then they have a fear of making mistakes. So they're not being innovative. They're not taking additional steps. They're not doing things. They're not making decisions. And then you become the bottleneck because every decision has to flow through you. There are definitely some costs to this overfunctioning. And I think it outweighs the benefits of overfunctioning because you can accidentally train people to overfunction around your overfunctioning. Because now they're having to work around you and what you're doing. So the more that you rescue, the less room people have to become more capable. And at some point you do, it's necessary for you as a leader to trust your team. It's necessary for you to go. I was talking to someone recently and they were like, well, I don't want to give them feedback. I don't want to hurt their feelings. I'm like, this person has a really challenging job. They do some really cool things. And now you're telling me that they are so fragile that they can't take a little bit of feedback or a little bit of criticism? Look at the work that they do, and you're telling me that you don't believe that they can handle a little bit of criticism. Are you telling me that your team is that fragile? And they had to stop and think, and they're like, well, I guess I hadn't really thought of it in that way. Because what are you saying? If you're like, I don't want them to, what? Feel a certain way, feel bad, be disappointed. What are the things you're trying to avoid from them? But at the end of the day, most of the time, it's not that you're trying to avoid them feeling something. You yourself are trying to avoid something. And that's not generous. It's not. That starts becoming control. You controlling the situation, you manipulating the situation, you avoiding over here and then overcompensating over here. And I'm not going to say that. I'm going to wait. I was talking to someone recently who was hiring for a new position, and they had a couple of external candidates and they had a couple of internal candidates. And there was one internal candidate potentially could have gotten the role. He didn't get the role. But the boss, when I was working with the boss, he said, well, he didn't do well in the interview and this question and this is how he answered it. And it was just not the way we need someone to think about this leadership role. And I was shocked and I said, did you give him that feedback? Well, not yet, because I wanted the disappointment of not getting the role to die down. And I'm thinking, the very thing, one of the most important things that he needs feedback on in his mindset, that absolutely was a reason why he didn't get the job, is the feedback he didn't get. Like, what are we doing? Why wouldn't he get the feedback over the very thing that was probably the most significant reason why he didn't get the job? And so we do that. We avoid and we're controlling and we manipulate. And so you want to be careful as a leader that you're not just telling people that you can't handle it. You're so fragile. We don't help people to develop in that way because we don't give them feedback. All right. I know that it's not malicious. I'm saying this. It's not malicious control. It's protective. I get it. You're trying to be protective. You don't want them to feel, nobody wants to hurt someone's feelings intentionally. You want to control the anxiety as well. So it's not malicious, but on the other side, you have to go, is this helpful? If everyone needs you to manage their emotions, is that the position that you want to be in? We want to help people to manage their own and take responsibility for their own emotions. So, what does healthy leadership in this functioning conversation look like and feel like? Well, healthy is letting people struggle appropriately. So there are times when it's okay for people to struggle through something. They come to you, they try something, they didn't get it right, and you go, nope, that's probably not the best way. Go try something else. Letting them have a bit of a struggle, and I say appropriately. So you have to learn when and how to jump in, step in, and to help them, but allowing them to struggle is the key point here. Tolerating discomfort for you and for them. Sometimes just because it's uncomfortable, you've heard me say this a million times, just because it's uncomfortable does not mean that it's wrong. Allowing some of that disappointment. It's okay. Not everything is going to work out smoothly and greatly. I'm working with a group of folks now who there are 7 of them for 4 slots. And they know that not everyone is going to get a role. So some of them we're talking about, okay, what do we do if you are not the one who gets chosen for one of these roles? Let's manage that disappointment. Let's prepare. Let's get another plan. Let's talk through how you're going to deal with that. There's no rescuing necessarily because they're the ones that's going to have to move on. And immediately allowing them to feel that disappointment. Yeah, that sucks. Sometimes you don't get what you want. Okay, so now how am I going to respond? How am I going to keep moving forward? Another healthy aspect is creating clarity instead of control. You can't just go, well, you're not doing it the way I would do it, and then not being clear on what your expectations are. You can support people without absorbing all the things, and then you having strategic contribution instead of just constant intervention. It's not necessary to micromanage and providing trust rather than the hypervigilance that we can sometimes have. Those are some of the things that look healthy from a leadership perspective. Healthy leadership is not, I'll carry everything. It's, I trust myself not to. I trust myself and I trust the team that we're going to be able to work together and pull all this together and grow in maturing in knowing the difference between support and rescue. There is a difference. So here are a few questions that as you go on and you start thinking about how much am I doing that maybe I need to pull back on? What am I afraid would happen if I stopped doing so much? Where have I confused being needed with being valuable? That's a very, very important thing. If no one needed me, would I stop feeling valuable? Is my only value coming from being needed? I'll put it that way. And I think that's an important question. Where does your value come from? That value is very externally driven and externally based versus that intrinsic value. Another question, what discomfort am I trying to avoid by stepping in? Am I avoiding discomfort for myself, for the team? And is it necessary? Is it okay that this might be a little bit uncomfortable? Am I solving problems that people need to learn through? When we take away the learning opportunity for people and then we get upset because they can't do anything, but we also don't give them the opportunity to learn and to grow. And then finally, what would happen if I allowed someone else to carry it out imperfectly? And this is also important. Not everything needs to be done perfectly to a T. So figuring out what's okay to be B work or even C work in some cases. As you ask yourself those questions, as you think about where you might be overfunctioning, as you think about where you might be being over responsible, because being responsible can turn into being over responsible. Think through what it is that you might be avoiding. Because when you're over functioning, you're in survival mode. And you can't survive and thrive at the same time. It's virtually impossible to do. And you want to transition from surviving so that you can start thriving, so you can start teaching your team to thrive. You don't have to keep surviving in rooms that no longer require survival. It's overkill. It's not necessary. So as you think about your level of functioning with yourself, with your team, how much energy that you're putting out, and how much you are putting into the emotional management when some of these things you just need to let be. I hope that this was helpful. I think that these are things that show up in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. These are hard conversations to have. These are hard thoughts to have. And often they come up in spaces where you give yourself the time and the space to actually be honest about what's really going on. And I hope that you have that. And if you don't, find a space to be able to do that. Okay. Thanks for stopping by, and I will see you next time. Hey, if something in this episode resonated, I want you to know you don't have to navigate it alone. This is the work we do inside the Leadership Lab, building capacity, strengthening decision-making, and learning how to lead with intention through change. If you're curious about working together, you'll find more information in the show notes. I'm glad you were here. I'll see you next time.